On a quiet evening in the village, Kanyan sat outside his small home, staring at the fading sun. No one would have guessed that this peaceful old man would soon be at the center of a tragic crime. His daughter Yejide had taken her own life just weeks before. Toju, Yejidide's husband, was the one Kanyan blamed for everything. Toju's harsh words, his cold behavior, and the constant pressure he placed on Yejide had pushed her to the edge. Kanyan had seen the sadness in her eyes, but it was too late to save her. The shock of Yejide's death shattered Kanyan. He couldn't shake the image of his daughter's broken spirit. For weeks he sat in silence, replaying the moments where he wished he had done more. The grief soon turned into anger, and that anger had one target: Toju. Everyone in the village whispered about the tragedy, but no one knew what was brewing in Kanyan's heart. The weight of loss had become too much for the elderly man, and he made a dark decision. He believed there was only one way to make things right. As the tension builds, the story takes a terrifying turn when Kanyan decides to confront Toju in a final showdown, one that would leave blood on the ground and a family forever broken. What started as grief and loss spiraled into an unspeakable act of revenge. This tragic tale of betrayal, pain, and the ultimate act of vengeance unfolds as we follow Kanyan's path and the deep scars left on a family, ending in the worst possible way. Kanyan had always been a man of few words, preferring the quiet life in the village. But his entire world crumbled the day his daughter, Yejide, took her own life. She was his only child, and the bond they shared was deep. Losing her in such a tragic way left a wound that would never heal. Yejidide's marriage to Toju had been far from perfect, and over the years Kanyan watched her spirit fade away under the weight of a troubled relationship. The news of her death left him devastated, but more than anything, it ignited a burning rage within him. Kanyan had always known that Yejide was unhappy in her marriage. Toju had a cold demeanor, and though he never laid a hand on Yejide physically, the emotional toll was evident. Yejide's laughter, once a constant in Kanyan's home, had become rare. Every time Kanyan saw her, she seemed more distant, her eyes carrying the weight of something unspoken. He tried to reach out, but Yejide was reluctant to share her pain. She always reassured him that things would get better, but they never did. The village was small, and news traveled fast. People whispered about how Toju's constant criticism and emotional neglect had driven Yejide into a state of despair. The burden of a failing marriage, combined with the pressure Toju placed on her to be the perfect wife, became too much for her to bear. Kanyan couldn't shake the image of his daughter, alone in that house, suffering in silence until she couldn't take it anymore. The thought of Toju living freely after all that had happened filled Kanyan with an unbearable rage. In the days following Yejide's funeral, Kanyan's grief morphed into something darker. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, and every time he closed his eyes, he saw Yejide's face, her sadness etched into his memory forever. The house felt empty without her presence, and everywhere he looked, there were reminders of the life that had been taken from him. He began to withdraw from the world, ignoring the concerned calls from family and friends. His mind was consumed by one thought: Toju had to pay. Kanyan started following Toju's every move, watching him from a distance as he went about his life as though nothing had changed. Toju still lived in the house he had shared with Yejide, and every time Kanyan saw him, the rage inside him grew. How could Toju carry on like that, laughing with friends, going to work, and continuing his routine as if Yejide had never existed? The injustice of it all was too much for Kanyan to bear. In the weeks that followed, Kanyan's anger festered into a plan. He had always believed in justice, but this time he couldn't rely on the law to provide it. Toju wasn't a man who could be easily punished by the courts. His emotional abuse was something that couldn't be quantified, and there would be no trial, no guilty verdict to ease Kanyan's pain. No, the only way to find peace would be to take matters into his own hands. Kanyan began to prepare for the inevitable. He had never been a violent man, but grief and anger had changed him. The quiet man who once tended to his small garden and enjoyed the simple pleasures of life was now consumed by thoughts of revenge. He started visiting places where he could gather the tools he needed for what he planned to do. Each step he took felt heavier than the last, but he knew there was no turning back. One cold evening, Kanyan stood outside Toju's house, his heart pounding in his chest. The decision had been made, and there was no room for second thoughts. As he watched the lights flicker inside, he gripped the handle of the tool he had brought with him. His hands shook, not out of fear, but out of anticipation. In his mind, this wasn't just about revenge, it was about justice. Yejidide's death could not go unanswered, and tonight, Kanyan would ensure that Toju felt the full weight of what he had done. The air was thick with tension as Kanyan took a deep breath and stepped forward. This moment had been building for weeks, and now it was time to bring it to an end. Canyon's decision was firm and there was no turning back. The moment he had chosen to exact revenge on Toju was coming closer, but the days leading up to it were filled with careful planning. He knew that a crime like this couldn't be committed on impulse, it had to be thought through. Canyon spent his time watching Toju, noting his routines and waiting for the right moment when his plan could be carried out without anyone around to witness it. Toju's life seemed unaffected by Yejide's death. Every time Canyon saw him, it was as though the tragedy had never happened. Toju continued to go about his life laughing with friends, attending events, and working. This only fueled Canyon's anger. He couldn't fathom how Toju could act as though Yejide's absence meant nothing. The thought of Toju living a life free from consequence made Canyon more determined to ensure that justice was served. One evening, Canyon followed Toju from his workplace. It wasn't the first time he had done this, but on this occasion, something felt different. Toju's usual stops were routine, sometimes a bar, sometimes a friend's place, but that night, Toju went home early. Canyon's heart raced. He knew this might be his chance to strike. Toju lived alone now, and his house was isolated, with few neighbors close enough to hear if anything happened. Canyon had been preparing for weeks, gathering the tools he needed and rehearsing what he would do in his mind. As he stood outside Toju's house, Canyon took deep breaths to steady himself. He was nervous, but not because of the fear of getting caught. His mind was filled with memories of Yejide, her laughter, her smile, and the life she could have lived if only Toju had treated her better. He felt no guilt about what he was about to do. In his eyes, this wasn't about revenge, it was about justice. Toju had taken his daughter's life in a way that could never be legally punished. Emotional abuse leaves no scars visible to the world, but Canyon had seen them. He had witnessed Yeji's slow unraveling, and tonight he would make sure Toju paid for it. As Canyon approached the house, he noticed the front door was slightly ajar. His heart skipped a beat, but he stayed focused. He had rehearsed this in his mind countless times. Enter, confront Toju, and then deliver the final act of justice. He stepped quietly into the hallway, gripping the small tool in his hand tightly. The house was quiet, but Canyon knew Toju was inside. His car was parked out front, and the lights were on. Canyon moved slowly, each step feeling like it carried the weight of the entire world. As he neared the living room, he could hear the faint sound of the television. Toju was sitting on the couch, completely unaware that his life was about to change forever. Canyon's palms were sweaty, but his grip on the tool remained steady. He stepped closer until he was standing just a few feet behind Toju. The moment had arrived. In that instant, all the pain, all the grief, all the anger that had consumed Canyon for weeks boiled over. Without a second thought, he swung the tool down hard. The blow landed with a sickening thud, and Toju slumped forward. Canyon's hands trembled as he stood over him, but the anger inside him hadn't diminished. He delivered another blow, and then another, until Toju lay motionless on the floor. Canyon stepped back, panting, the reality of what he had done slowly sinking in. The house was silent, save for the faint sound of the television in the background. Toju was dead, and Canyon's mission was complete. But as he looked down at the lifeless body, a strange feeling washed over him. It wasn't the sense of satisfaction he had expected. There was no relief, no peace. Instead, there was only a hollow emptiness. Canyon stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the scene before him. He had thought this would bring him closure, that taking Toju's life would somehow make up for the loss of his daughter. But as he gazed down at Toju's body, he realized that nothing could bring Yejide back. She was gone, and no amount of revenge could change that. The next step in Canyon's plan was to leave, but his feet felt like they were glued to the floor. He hadn't thought about what would happen after the murder, he had only been focused on carrying it out. The reality of what he had done started to weigh on him. His mind raced with thoughts of how he would get away, how he would hide what he had done, but none of it seemed to matter anymore. The anger that had driven him for so long was gone, leaving only regret in its wake. The moments following the murder were a blur for Canyon. His mind, which had been focused and sharp during the crime, was now filled with confusion and a growing sense of dread. He stood in the living room, looking down at the lifeless body of Toju. The reality of what he had done was starting to set in, but there was no time to dwell on it. Canyon knew he had to move quickly. Every second he stayed increased the risk of someone finding out what had happened. The plan he had so carefully constructed in his mind now seemed scattered and fragile. He hadn't planned on what to do after the murder, only on the act itself. Now, the weight of the consequences was heavy on his shoulders. Canyon's eyes darted around the room, trying to make sense of his next move. He had to clean up, erase any trace of his presence, but his hands trembled as he moved through the house. He found a cloth and began wiping surfaces, taking care not to leave fingerprints. It wasn't as easy as he had imagined. Every action felt slow, and the panic rising in his chest made it hard to focus. As he worked, his mind kept replaying the moment he struck Toju over and over, like a scene from a nightmare. The sound of the blow echoed in his head, and the sight of Toju's body wouldn't leave his mind. He glanced at the clock. Minutes had passed, but it felt like hours. Canyon had to hurry. He couldn't risk staying here much longer. He grabbed the tool he had used, making sure it was wiped clean of prints, and stuffed it into a plastic bag. His breathing was shallow, and his heart pounded in his chest. He hadn't realized how exhausting the act of murder would be, not just physically, but mentally. The guilt, the fear, the anxiety, it was all consuming. Canyon's mind raced with possibilities. Could he make this look like an accident? Could he frame someone else? These thoughts swirled in his head, but none of them seemed realistic. This wasn't something he could undo or shift blame for. He had committed murder, and now he had to live with the consequences. Just as he was about to leave, a noise from outside froze him in place. Footsteps. Someone was approaching the house. Canyon's heart raced as he ducked into the nearest room, peeking through the crack in the door. His worst fear was coming true. Someone had come to the house, possibly a neighbor or a friend of Toju's. Canyon's mind scrambled for a solution. If they came inside and saw the scene, it would all be over. The footsteps grew louder, and Canyon braced himself for the worst. He gripped the tool tightly, ready to defend himself if necessary. But then, the footsteps stopped. A voice called out, and Canyon recognized it as one of Toju's neighbors. She was calling out to see if Toju was home. Canyon held his breath, praying that she wouldn't come inside. After a few tense moments, the footsteps retreated, and Canyon exhaled in relief. The close call shook him to his core. He couldn't stay any longer. He had to leave before someone else showed up. Canyon moved quickly now, careful to avoid making any noise. He grabbed the bag with the tool and slipped out the back door, disappearing into the night. The cool air outside hit him like a wave, but it did little to calm the storm of emotions raging inside him. Canyon made his way through the quiet streets, his mind racing with the weight of what he had just done. He replayed the murder in his head, trying to make sense of it, but it all felt surreal. How had his life come to this? As he walked, Canyon couldn't help but think about Yejide. He had done this for her to avenge her death, but now that it was over, he wasn't sure if it had been worth it. He had taken a life, but it hadn't brought Yejide back. The emptiness he felt after her death was still there, and now it was accompanied by a deep sense of regret. He found himself walking towards the small park where he and Yejide used to go when she was younger. It was quiet now, just like his life had become. Canyon sat on a bench, staring out into the dark, and for the first time since the murder, he allowed himself to feel the weight of his actions. The satisfaction he had expected wasn't there. Instead, there was only a hollow void. Canyon knew that he couldn't go back to his old life. The man he had been before Yejide's death was gone, replaced by someone he barely recognized. The rage that had driven him was now gone, leaving only the consequences of his actions. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and now he had to figure out what to do next. As the hours passed and the sky began to lighten with the approaching dawn, Canyon stood up from the bench. He didn't know what his future held, but one thing was clear: his life had changed forever. As Canyon made his way out of Toju's home, the weight of the murder pressed harder on his shoulders. The night air was cold, but it did nothing to numb the panic building inside him. His thoughts raced, trying to piece together his next steps. He had planned so much for this moment, yet the reality of what had happened made him question everything. How would he cover his tracks? Who would believe his side of the story if he was caught? His breathing became shallow as the enormity of the crime settled in. He had avenged Yejide's death, but there was no satisfaction in it, only a deeper sense of loss and fear. Canyon knew the clock was ticking, and he couldn't afford to waste any time. He had to get rid of any evidence that connected him to Toju's murder. His steps quickened as he walked toward the small river just outside the town. It was dark, and the path was narrow, but Canyon's focus was singular. He had to dispose of the weapon. He reached the riverbank, the sound of water rushing in the darkness giving him a brief moment of comfort. Canyon took the plastic bag containing the weapon and held it tightly. He had wiped off any fingerprints, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something would go wrong. He leaned over the edge of the river, took a deep breath, and let the bag slip from his hands. The sound of it splashing into the water seemed louder than he expected, but it was done. The tool that had ended Toju's life was gone, swallowed by the current. For a moment, Canyon stood there, staring at the water, hoping it would wash away more than just the evidence. But the guilt stayed with him. He turned and walked back toward his house, avoiding the main roads. Every passing car felt like a threat. He imagined police sirens blaring and officers knocking on his door, ready to arrest him. His paranoia grew with every step. By the time he reached home, Canyon's hands were shaking, and his mind was racing. He locked the door behind him and sank onto his couch. Silence filled the room, but it wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that made every little noise seem louder. Canyon's thoughts jumped from one scenario to another. What if someone had seen him leave Toju's house? What if the police traced the murder back to him? There were too many variables, too many things that could go wrong. As he sat there, Canyon's phone buzzed. His heart skipped a beat. Who could be calling him at this hour? His hands trembled as he picked up the phone, but it was just a text from his brother Tunde, asking if he was okay. Canyon didn't respond. He couldn't. What could he say? That he had just murdered a man in cold blood. That he was a criminal now, no better than the people he had always despised. Hours passed, but sleep didn't come. Canyon couldn't stop replaying the murder in his head. The way Toju had fallen, the sound of the impact, it all haunted him. As the first light of dawn crept through his window, Canyon knew he had to get out of the house. Staying here alone with his thoughts was driving him mad. He grabbed his jacket and headed out the door, unsure of where he was going but knowing he couldn't stay inside any longer. Canyon walked aimlessly through the streets, trying to shake off the guilt that clung to him like a shadow. He ended up in the same park where he and Yejide used to play as kids. The swings creaked in the morning breeze, and the memories of happier times flooded back. But they didn't bring comfort. They only reminded him of how far he had fallen. Sitting on a bench, Canyon thought about Yejide. Would she have wanted this? Would she have approved of what he had done? His mind was filled with doubt. The revenge he had sought for so long had not brought him peace. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Canyon noticed something odd. There were a few people gathered at the edge of the park, whispering to each other and looking toward the street. Curiosity got the better of him, and Canyon walked over to see what was happening. His heart sank when he saw what they were looking at. 2 police cars were parked on the street, and officers were talking to a group of people, asking questions. Canyon's mind raced. Were they looking for him? Had someone already reported the murder? He felt his stomach churn as he watched the scene unfold. He couldn't stay here any longer. Without another glance, he turned and walked quickly away from the park, trying to keep his head down. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Canyon wandered the streets, avoiding people, avoiding anything that reminded him of what he had done. But no matter how far he walked, he couldn't escape his own mind. The weight of the murder was too much to bear, and it was only a matter of time before it crushed him completely. By evening, Canyon knew he couldn't run forever. The police would find Toju's body eventually, and when they did, the investigation would start. They would ask questions, look for witnesses, and it wouldn't be long before they connected the dots. Canyon realized with growing dread that his time was running out. He had crossed a line that he could never uncross, and now he had to face the consequences. As darkness fell once again, Canyon returned home. He locked the door behind him and sat in the dimly lit room, his mind racing. The police were getting closer, and there was nothing he could do to stop them. As the investigation into Toju's murder deepened, the detectives began to piece together the puzzle. Neighbors who had seen Canyon enter Toju's house earlier that evening were interviewed. While no one had seen the actual murder take place, the growing suspicion around Canyon was becoming too obvious to ignore. Detective Ife, who had taken over the case, was known for his relentless pursuit of justice. He didn't miss details, and his instinct told him that Canyon was hiding something crucial. The days following the murder were tense. Canyon avoided everyone, trying to go about his routine while battling the fear that gnawed at him. Every knock at the door sent a chill down his spine, and the ringing of his phone made him jump. He knew the truth was closing in. The guilt he felt for killing Toju, despite the justification he had convinced himself of, was unbearable. Yejide's death had driven him to this point, but now even her memory seemed tainted by the violence he had committed. The turning point came when Canyon's brother Tunde began noticing the drastic change in Canyon's behavior. Tunde had always been close to Canyon, but recently he had sensed something darker lurking beneath the surface. The withdrawn nature, the restless nights, and the avoidance of family, it was all starting to make sense. Tunde, in his own quiet way, decided to confront Kanyan. One evening, Tunde showed up unannounced at Kanyan's apartment. The atmosphere inside was heavy, and the tension between the brothers was palpable. Kanyan tried to act normal, but his nervousness betrayed him. Tunde, however, was patient. He didn't accuse Kanyan of anything, but he asked gentle questions, hoping to get his brother to open up. At first, Kanyan deflected, claiming stress and fatigue. But as the conversation deepened, Tunde pressed harder. He brought up Yejiade and how her death had affected the family. The mention of Yejiade's name was enough to break Kanyan's fragile composure. His eyes welled up with tears, and for the first time since the murder, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he had done. In a trembling voice, Kanyan began to confess. He told Tunde everything: how he had found out about Toju's cruel treatment of Yejiade, how he had sought revenge in a blind rage, and how he had believed that killing Toju would bring him peace. But there was no peace. Instead, Kanyan had only found more pain, more regret. As the confession spilled out, Tunde listened in stunned silence, unable to believe that his brother had been driven to such an extreme act. Tunde, torn between love for his brother and the need for justice, faced an impossible decision. He knew Kanyan had acted out of desperation and grief, but the law was clear: murder was murder, no matter the circumstances. After an agonizing silence, Tunde gently placed his hand on Kanyan's shoulder, telling him that there was only one way out now. Kanyan had to turn himself in. The weight of those words crushed Kanyan, but deep down, he knew Tunde was right. Running from the truth had only made things worse, and the guilt was destroying him from the inside. That night, Kanyan made the decision to surrender. He couldn't live with the lies any longer. The following morning, Kanyan, with Tunde by his side, walked into the police station. Detective Ife was waiting, having already suspected Kanyan's involvement. The confession was swift, and the evidence that had been piling up made Kanyan's guilt undeniable. He recounted every detail of the murder, the planning, the moment he snapped, and the aftermath. As he spoke, Kanyan felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time since Yejiade's death, he felt like he was finally doing the right thing. The trial that followed was intense. The courtroom was filled with emotions as the details of Yejiade's death and Toju's murder were laid bare. Kanyan's defense centered on the abuse Yejiade had endured, but the prosecution was relentless in their pursuit of justice for Toju. The media attention only made things worse, painting Kanyan as a man consumed by rage, a vigilante who had taken the law into his own hands. Despite the complexities of the case, the jury reached a verdict after several days of deliberation. Kanyan was found guilty of manslaughter, with the mitigating factor being Yejiade's tragic death and Toju's role in driving her to suicide. The judge, recognizing the pain that had fueled Kanyan's actions, handed down a sentence that reflected the gravity of the crime, but also acknowledged the deep emotional torment Kanyan had suffered. As the sentence was read, Kanyan felt a mix of emotions. There was no joy in the outcome, no sense of victory. He would serve time, and the years ahead would be difficult, but for Kanyan, the true punishment had already begun the moment he had taken Toju's life. The prison walls would be nothing compared to the prison of guilt he had built around himself. Tunde, heartbroken yet resolute, stood by Kanyan's side through it all. The bond between the brothers remained, even in the face of such tragedy. Kanyan would serve his time, but Tunde knew that healing would take far longer. The loss of Yejiade, the murder of Toju, and the unraveling of their family would leave scars that might never fully heal. As Kanyan was led away in handcuffs, he looked back at Tunde, who gave him a nod of quiet support. Kanyan's journey toward redemption would be long, but at least now he wasn't running from the truth.